know this will surprise everyone, but I don't have a lot of experience with animal preservation. I'm not a hunter, and while I've done a fair amount of fishing, nothing I have ever caught would impress anyone remotely enough that I'd want to mount it and hang it on a wall. Probably the last experience I've had with preserved animals came during frog dissection in 9th grade biology. But Divya Ananthraman is a professional taxidermist, and her approach is so interesting that it's hard not to have a million questions. We edit that number down a bit on today's Northwards. Plus how the North Country inspired best-selling author Liz Moore's latest novel, and the story of Donna Stoner's artistic post-retirement life. Northwards is next from North Country Public Radio. This is Northwards, the monthly interview show coming to you from NCPR. I'm Mitch Teich. We're going to meet a professional taxidermist in just a minute. And, like a lot of people, I've gone to my share of natural history museums over the years and looked at the dioramas with preserved animals, some of which are now extinct, the passenger pigeon, the ivory-billed woodpecker, and I'd look and maybe even look closely at the specimens and then move on to the next one. But Divya Ananthraman would encourage you not to just move on. To listen to her talk is to remember that the animals that taxidermists preserve lived lives, and that before the animals were sent to them, they were flying or climbing trees or maybe burrowing under your garden shed. Ananthraman lives in New York City and is the person behind Gotham Taxidermy and has won a slew of awards for her work. She also travels the country teaching workshops and encouraging others who might want to try their hands at the field, even if they aren't thinking of it as a career. That included a couple of workshops at the Adirondack Experience this month. I caught up with her ahead of those workshops by Zoom from her New York studio. Very nice to meet you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So where do you think taxidermy falls in the continuum where maybe art is on one end and science is on the other?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it falls right in the middle. It contains, to me, it contains the best of both worlds. It contains the best of art and the best of science, which is amazing because both of those worlds have so many wonderful aspects to them.
Was it one side or the other, the art or the science, that first attracted you to the field? I mean, how did you happen to come to it?
What attracted me to the field was that taxidermy really does contain, so much equal parts of art and science. I think the fact that it didn't really fit fully, it didn't fit fully into one or the other, that it contained multitudes. I think that's what attracted me to it. And that is what keeps me interested in it today.
Were you a science-y kid or someone that just was into animals? Or, I think being interested in it is one thing, but kind of pursuing it as either a hobby or a profession as you do is something a little more than that.
Absolutely. So what attracted me to taxidermy first was truly it was a love of animals. A lot of taxidermists grow up in, the woods or access to a lot of, they're around nature. They are surrounded by nature, whether it's, forests, mountains, and these places we think of as these holy, sacred, natural spaces. I grew up in Miami and I currently live and have been living for the past 22 years in New York City. So I've always been in an urban environment, but I was an animal lover, especially a lover of birds because birds do frequent all of these urban environments. And the way I made a lot of my first and most memorable connections to animals was going to natural history museums and seeing taxidermy. And although they weren't as lively as the animals that are outside that you can observe with live observation, what the taxidermy did was it gave me that time with animals. You can sit by a diorama until the museum closes. You can have all the time you want with that animal, which you don't get with wild observation. And you're not guaranteed wild observation either. So it was really just a love and fascination of animals that brought me to it. And seeing what that stillness illuminates that kept me and still keeps me going with it.
Do you remember the first animal you ever worked on doing a taxidermy project?
Yes, I do. It was a small gray squirrel that I'd found. I was hiking and it was very snowy outside. So I was like, oh my gosh, this squirrel is literally frozen. Um, so yeah, it was this gray squirrel and it was so horrible. It turned out so horribly, but I was just hooked on the process. And I really do wish I'd kept it because I gave it to a friend, but I really wish I'd kept it because I'd love to look back on it and to see if it was really as horrible as I remembered it being. I think that, I think being a beginner, you kind of, you expect something, but then you kind of are, I think beginners are much harder on themselves than someone who's done something for a long time. So yeah, I wish I'd kept it.
Did it feel like a big step for you to come across this frozen squirrel and like actually pick it up and take it home with you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to remember every taxidermy project starts with an animal and that animal had a life and that there's so much reverence to that life that is contained there. I think that that's something that never leaves and that just that through the years, like I've been doing taxidermy professionally for about 10 years. And so through the years, there are lots of things and lots of professions you get desensitized to. There's like almost an increased or like a hypersensitivity to that reverence for life that's there. So I feel like what has changed is the first time that I saw that squirrel, the first time that I came across that little body, I didn't have the words for what I felt. Now I have a few more words, but I don't think I'll ever fully have all the words for those emotions and just that feeling of like, wow, life is so precious. Life is kind of miraculous, this little tiny body contains, a tiny heart, a tiny brain, little lungs, like it contained all these things that created life and processed life and held life. And now I'm trying to take this thing apart and put it back together so other people can feel this sense of wonder and kind of make their own connection to this animal. Yeah.
You mentioned natural history museums, and that's I'm sure where most of us first encountered taxidermy, and for a long time, that was the main way these museums did exhibits, and I know that's changed in some ways, but it does still seem to be a big part of the equation.
I think so. I think that natural history museums, there is so much importance in the connection to animals that people have, especially for an urban environment, especially as, cities get bigger and bigger, which is, these are the epicenters where people are living, but it still doesn't mean that we can stop thinking about nature. We still live on this planet. I can live fully in the middle of the concrete jungle, but I'm still a part of nature. We're all still a part of nature. And I think that natural history museums, with taxidermy especially, they play this really important role in connecting us to nature and showing us that, although we're separated by glass, this bird can fly and I can't. I have to buy a ticket and wait in line and go through security if I want to fly, I can just get up and flap away. But there's a beauty in that, right? There's beauty in like, oh, what are our differences? What are our similarities? How are we connected? And you kind of experience the gravity and the presence of that animal through taxidermy and through something sculptural in a way that you can't experience through a digital or a two-dimensional. Being around that presence and and even contemplating mortality, the fact that there was a death there, I think that those are all such important um, those are such important conversations that we need to have, especially as our ecology is so delicate and so threatened.
So we're talking a couple of days before you do some workshops at the Adirondack Experience, and I know you do other workshops around the country. In fact, do you have a sense for well, I guess maybe this is two questions.
Yeah.
Why others want to try their hand in your field, and why the educational part of what you do is such an important aspect of your work.
Oh my gosh, we could have a whole hour where I talk about this specific topic. Yeah, I think that so yes, I'm teaching classes at the Adirondack Experience this weekend. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to teach there. It's a beautiful place, and they're so passionate about the ecology of their location, all the nature there, and they do such a beautiful job of of showing you what that area is and why it's so important. Um, With the classes in general, I think what I love about teaching is sharing, sharing this craft, this art, this science, putting it in other people's hands and seeing what they do with it. For a long time, taxidermy and the related practices of, specimen preparation and just the work around death and aftercare of animals was very guarded and very gate kept. And that was a huge challenge for me when I was trying to learn it. There weren't a lot of classes that were accessible to me either by location because, I'm in the city, didn't have a car, so couldn't drive anywhere, couldn't drive, and also didn't want to invest like a whole week or 2 weeks or a month in something that at that time I didn't know if it would be a career or just a hobby. So it's, investments of time, investments of money, investments of location and movement. Like those are barriers that people face. So I think I think when you kind of remove those barriers and start to make the classes a little more accessible, that's something that's very exciting and very interesting. I think the other thing I'm seeing, and it kind of goes back to your previous question about change, I think the other thing I'm seeing with the classes is that there's so much diversity in who comes to take the classes. It's people who have been historically excluded from this field and people from all different backgrounds. Some people take this class and they're not trying to become a taxidermist. They just want to try something with their hands. They want to connect to animals and nature. There's that aspect. And there's also the aspect that this gets you away from a screen. It's the most real life experience you can have, really. You're confronting life, you're confronting death, you're confronting this being, and it's like you and this animal, and you're in a place with it. And you have to learn like a bunch of different skills like sewing, sculpting, looking at anatomy, kind of seeing a bit of engineering and how something works and how to put it back together. So I think that it's a combination of all of those things of removing the barriers, making it accessible, and giving people an experience that is less and less common in our daily lives. I think that's what brings people to it. And on top of that, just having an outlet for creativity and curiosity.
Not to overstate the differences between people in New York or Los Angeles or Philadelphia and people in the North Country where wildlife is so much closer. Do you feel differences when you're working in a place like the Adirondack experience versus, going to some place like Philadelphia or LA?
Absolutely. There's such a difference. And I think the best thing about teaching is that as I'm teaching taxidermy, I'm teaching this skill, but I get to learn. Like, this is a beautiful thing that I tell all of my students. I'm teaching, but I'm also learning from all of my students. I'm learning about their experiences and their perspectives. And I think all of that just it just enriches the field. Students in the big cities are going to have one experience and background with wildlife. Students in places where you are completely immersed in nature have another experience with wildlife. And there's so much beauty and learning in all of that.
So on the occasions when you're not traveling and doing workshops, what is a day in the life of a professional taxidermist like?
The day in the life of a professional taxidermist would be really similar to a day in the life of probably any small business owner or artist practitioner of any type. So I'm usually working in my studio. I do classes at my studio as well in New York City. That's usually on the weekends, but the weekdays I'm working in my studio, working on commission projects, working on projects for projects for different clients. There's also, of course, like administrative work, the not so fun stuff like emails and bookkeeping and all of that. But yeah, it's really like a day of doing all different types of work.
For somebody who's never gone through the process, how long does a typical commission piece take from, I guess, beginning to end?
That's a great question. So it really depends on, like, the length of a project really depends on difficulty of the project, how complex it is. So it's not necessarily size that is the factor as opposed to complexity, because something very small, like, if I'm working on a hummingbird or something, that can actually take me a lot longer to work on than a crow because the details are much smaller and much finer. So I would say a project can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months or even a few years if it's a really large project. And to be sustainable as a business, you've also got to work on multiple projects at a time. So when you add that to it, you're looking at something that is not fast, but is very rewarding.
Well, and forgive me if this is a strange question, but what does your studio smell like?
It smells like a Santa Maria, this like candle I got from this store in New York called Santa Maria Novella. It's like my favorite store. That's like these scents that have been made in a monastery in Florence since like since before time, I guess. So it smells old, but not in a bad way. It smells like an old, like something from the 12th century, I guess.
Who do you feel like you're honoring when you take a client's project on?
That's a great question. When I take a client's project on, I'm honoring the client really because I'm wanting to give them I'm trying to give them what they're expecting and trying to give them what they're looking for. There's also, you're also honoring the animal. Like there's no denying that. I think that it's so dependent, like if I'm working with a companion animal, I'm honoring that animal, the client, and their relationship. That's really what you're honoring. If I'm working on something more straightforward, like something for a scientific organization, you're honoring that organization, the animal, and the audience, the public who's going to see that animal, right? You're sort of coming up with, okay, you're like, okay, we need to do it in this pose. Well, this pose, why? What story is this pose telling? What, what's the message it's sending to other people? So you're really honoring, the people involved and their relationship to the animal, so that that animal itself, and honoring the animal in turn to do that. So it's sort of like not just one specific entity, but it's like the animals, the people, and their connection to each other.
Well, I mean, it's really fascinating work that you do, and you talk about it so eloquently, Divya.
Oh,
I'm
thank
so
you.
grateful to have gotten to spend some time with you.
Thank you so much. This was so great. I'm really glad.
Divya Ananthraman is a taxidermist and the proprietor of New York City-based Gotham Taxidermy. We talked with her just before she came to Blue Mountain Lake for a couple of taxidermy workshops at the Adirondack Experience. You'll find a link to more about her work at ncpr.org/northwards. A novel set in the North Country made former President Barack Obama's summer reading list. We'll learn about writer Liz Moore's connection to our region when Northwards continues from NCPR.
Northwards is supported by Claxton Hepburn Medical Center, providing North Country residents with access to specialized care at their wound health center. claxtonhepburn.org. Learn how your business can sponsor Northwards and help support the station named the National Small Market Radio Station of Overall Excellence by the RTDNA. Email sponsorship at ncpr.org.
More of Northwards now. I'm Mitch Teich. There are probably a half dozen books on my nightstand that I have gotten halfway through and set aside. Not because I'm not enjoying them, but because I am enjoying them. You see, I hate to read good books too quickly, maybe because I don't want them to end, or maybe because I'm afraid there will come a point where I'm disappointed. I'll get into a book, and if I like it, I'll fly through the first 100 pages and then quickly set it down and start reading something else. Maybe a magazine or another book, maybe even 3 other books, or just a cereal box. It's like starting to eat lunch and putting my sandwich down in favor of a bunch of carrot sticks. I know, it's weird. But anyway, I read a book recently that was the exception to the rule. The book is The God of the Woods, and honestly, I really couldn't put it down. It's true to say that it is a compelling mystery spanning a quarter century and 475 pages, but it is also true to say that its very accurate North Country setting is the icing on the cake, and its setting is almost as much a character as the people who inherit the story. I won't say anything else because we'll let the author, Liz Moore, do the talking. Thank you so much for taking the time. It is great to meet you.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm really delighted to be here.
All right, so let's start by setting up your regional bona fides, if we could. This is a really familiar setting in this book to probably everyone here in the North Country, but what is your historic connection to this region?
Sure, yeah. On my mother's side, I had 4 ancestors who moved to the Southern Adirondacks in the early 1800s and settled in a community on the banks of the Sacandaga River. and they were there to be farmers. So our, family lore, and then I did a little bit of ancestral research as I was writing this, says that they started two separate farms there. And they did okay. The land was actually pretty fertile because it was near the banks of the Sacandaga. But then, as many of your listeners probably already know, the public works project that created the Sacandaga Reservoir in the early 1900s came along, thus displacing my ancestors and causing my grandmother and my mother to be raised just south of the Adirondacks. But my grandparents built a cabin in the woods nearby, and that's a place that we have been going as a family since the 60s. And now I bring my own kids there. And so I have spent many, many, many hours, days, weeks, months in the Adirondacks.
Well, and presumably,
I live in Philadelphia now, by the way. I don't live in the Adirondacks.
Presumably, though, because you keep coming up, there is something that draws you to this place.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a lot of, I still have cousins in the area. So, and my grandmother and lived in the area until she died. But I love it myself, as an individual. It's hugely important to me. It's a place where I find that my creativity is at its peak. I wrote large swaths of this book and actually all my books in the Adirondacks, in the cabin, but also, at various public libraries, at a couple of coffee shops nearby. And it's just a place that's so significant to me and to my creative imagination.
But to be clear, I think I know the answer to this, but your family's property and your Adirondack experience is probably nothing like the Van Laars that we read about in the book.
Yes, thank you for making that clarification. Our cabin was actually built by hand by my grandparents, who were not particularly, qualified. They had help from a family member who was more qualified than they were, but it is a cabin, a very modest cabin that is nothing like the mansion in the wilderness that the Van Laar family has constructed for themselves, which is more along the lines of the famous Adirondack Great Camps built in the region in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah. So what set you on the path to telling this particular story?
Yeah, well, for those who haven't encountered the book, should I set it up a little bit?
Yeah, if you would.
So The God of the Woods is the story of the Van Laar family, who are a wealthy family who build what amounts to a mansion in the wilderness, a great camp. Just down the hill from there, they build a summer camp that they found with the purpose of educating the children of the wealthy in survival skills. In the summer of 1975, the Van Laar family sends their own 13-year-old daughter, Barbara, to the summer camp on their summer property, which they've never done before. And very quickly, she goes missing from the camp. But the catch is that she's not the first child of theirs to have gone missing, because 14 years earlier, their son also went missing from the same grounds, although not the summer camp. And so the question is sort of, what happened to both children? Did two separate forces cause them to disappear? Was it the same force? Was it someone in the family? Was it someone from the local community, which is predominantly working class and which serves the Van Laars personally and professionally? And so, yeah, that's the story of the God of the Woods. In large part, my inspiration came from my own family history in the region and the many, many hours that I've spent there, and all the kind of sensory details that I'm able to gather just by being in the woods in that place. But also, I would say a couple of secondary sources of inspiration were the real life serial killer, Robert Garrow, who will be familiar to many of your listeners, I'm sure, especially if they remember the 1970s in the Adirondacks. I think every family with an Adirondack connection or who lived in the Adirondacks probably has like a near miss story with Robert Garrow, and my own family does as well. My uncle likes to tell one. My father, although he's not local to the Adirondacks, he married into the family, loved to tell us kind of like spooky stories about Garrow as we were kids, like to kind of frighten us about who could be lurking in the wilderness.
Did that work?
To a certain extent, I do have to say, I'm not at all a person who feels frightened by the wilderness. I feel sort of at home in the woods, and I always have. But the book begins with an epigraph by Anne Labastille, who I love talking to this, this radio station because you probably know all the people that I'm referencing, unlike most of the other people that I speak to about this book. Anyway, I'm a fan of the work of Anne Labastille, and in Woodswoman, she talks about how the beauty of nature and the peril of nature are really two sides of the same coin. And I have that, I understand that sentiment very well, and it sort of drove the book. But yeah, there is a kind of a secondary character loosely based on Garrow, who's like hovering in the background of the camp, and in both time periods when both children go missing, he's on the loose. So there are questions about whether he could have had something to do with it as well.
Well, one of the great ironies that runs through this whole story is the name of this great camp, that this big estate that the Van Laars live on, and it is
Self-Reliance, which I wanted the title of the book to be as well, but I was overruled. So the Van Laars pride themselves on being big fans of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and the transcendentalists who made the case for being completely self-reliant. But the thing that the local people point out is that there's a great irony in prizing self-reliance in this way, because the family is not at all self-reliant. In fact, they are entirely reliant on the labor of the local community, including for the building of the house, which was brought over from Europe. And so a driver on the way bringing a new family member to the compound basically jokes that, it wasn't the Van Laars who moved that lumber, despite the name Self-Reliance. And I think the Van Laars really do value it is sort of, it's incredibly important to them to believe themselves to be self-reliant, but only in ways that they deem acceptable. So they don't want their daughter to be at all self-reliant, for example.
Yeah, there's a self-reliance that's sort of coexisting, if you can, with misogyny.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. I think the women of the book are, across all social classes, are inhibited by the feeling that the men in their social class don't actually want them to be self-reliant, if it means being defiant at all.
Well, and you mentioned the various social classes. I think one of the other themes that kind of runs throughout this book, and one that might resonate pretty strongly with readers up here, might be income disparity. People sometimes describe the North Country as these little pockets of wealth surrounded by trees and poverty. What were you hoping to explore in that contrast?
Yeah. So income inequality is a theme that comes up a lot in the book. Class, the disparity, the discrepancy between the way that different characters from different classes are treated. It's unfortunately a theme that has only grown and become more relevant as time has gone on, because income inequality itself has grown as time has gone on over the past 50 years. I think it does resonate any place where there are people who are working and sort of surviving in a region year round, and people who come in for the summer, for example. My perspective is interesting because I have, family history in the region, and my ancestors were local to the community and were working class people within the community. But now, I've never lived there year round. And so I wouldn't call myself a summer person because we come in most seasons, but I certainly am an outsider to the community in other ways. And that's something that, perhaps I was able to write from different perspectives for that reason.
Apologies for this question that now suddenly strikes me as maybe not a question, but I think there's a question at the heart of it. One of the things that strikes me about the Van Laars, at least the elder Van Laars. I mean, you mentioned the daughter who goes to the camp, and she is a very interesting and intriguing character. But the men of the Van Laars are not really interesting people. And what Alice, who marries into the family, goes through is interesting and compelling to read. But on the whole, the picture you paint does not make you want to hang out with these people. As a writer, how challenging was it to develop a family that, in some ways, is pretty two-dimensional?
Yeah, I think every person in the book is facing their own set of challenges. Sometimes it's easier to see what the challenges a person might be facing are if you get a close third point of view on them. So for Alice, who at first seems to be a pretty stereotypical, I don't know, rich lady who's mean to her staff, I wrote, if not from her point of view, I wrote in the close third perspective around her character a lot. And I was able to kind of imagine what her life was like before her marriage into the Van Laar family, and to imagine some motive for why she behaves the way she does today. There are certain characters I couldn't write, whose heads I could not access for reasons that were either personal, like I didn't feel like I could relate to them well, or logistical, like I couldn't write from their perspective because it would give too much away about the mystery. And perhaps those characters are the characters that we know the least, or who feel the least multidimensional in the end. But I will say it is also true that I perhaps have a personal bias against characters like the men of the Van Laar family, who seem to me to value wealth over all else. Yeah.
Well, and I hope that wasn't an insulting question. It just,
No.
it's, in some ways, we get this really rich picture of a lot of the characters, and the Van Laar men are almost silhouettes in some ways, and to the benefit of the book, I think.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's necessity. I think as I move forward, this is my fifth novel, and I'm leaning more and more and more into the mystery genre, which means following some of the conventions of that genre that go against, the instincts I would have had when I was a younger writer, including sometimes just letting characters be bad, which is kind of fun, but hopefully not implausible. I do think there are some people who are just bad too, if I'm being honest.
But none of them in the story actually twirls their mustache evilly, as far as I can
No
remember.
mustache twirling.
Okay.
No, I edited that out.
Why was it important to set this story in both the early 60s and mid 70s? They seem like pivotal times, but maybe you could explain why.
Yeah, so some of it was mathematical. I wanted, I didn't want there to have been too many generations since the creation of the Adirondack Park Preserve, because the first of the Van Laars to settle or to build the house in the region did so upon the creation of the Adirondack Park. And so I wanted him to be a memory that the other characters in the book would have had. And for the working class families, I wanted them to have an ancestral memory of a time before the preserve was created. Also, I just identified the 60s and the 70s as times of great social change in the rest of the country and in the North Country as well. Just maybe not at the Van Laar Preserve itself, because the Van Laars have this vested interest in maintaining the status quo because it serves them. And so I liked the idea that there could be upheaval going on and new ideas trickling in just outside the boundaries of the Van Laar Preserve without it. And I liked to imagine this family like working really, really hard to stave off the social change that was coming in, both from the people who worked for them and from some of the younger members of their own family.
Right, Barbara, the Van Laar's daughter, is into punk rock, for example, which is not something that you can imagine the Van Laar family as a whole really embracing at that point. Or
She's
ever.
an early adopter of some pretty alternative music and clothing choices.
The women of the story, who are really, they're really the heroes of the story, and in just about every way, they're also at pivotal points in their lives.
That's true. So it is a real ensemble piece in the sense that we get close third person points of view from Alice Van Laar, from Louise, who's a counselor who grows up in the nearby fictional town of Shattuck, which I did an event in Saratoga, and somebody was like, Shattuck, that must be Chattagay, right? And I was like, no, I swear it was total coincidence. I just made it up. Anyway, not Chattagay. So Louise has a close third point of view. She's the counselor. There's a character named Tracy, who's a 12-year-old who's coming to camp for the first time, who has a close third point of view. You're right. The majority of the close third points of view are women, with a few exceptions. There's a character named Carl Stoddard, who is a volunteer firefighter, who works on the preserve at the time of the first kid's disappearance. There is the Jacob Sluter character who's kind of modeled on Garrow, and he gets a close third point of view. So I don't know. It's whatever, I don't make, there's no calculus to it. I just kind of start writing in a character's voice and decide if I like writing from that character's point of view. And also if it's going to reveal too much information that I can't reveal, which sometimes is the case. And then I have to backpedal.
All right, so big picture question here. How do you square this image that you paint of this place? This kind of nuanced but really troubled in a lot of ways, with a place that you have this affection for?
Well, I'm a writer who likes a good story. And so wherever I choose to set a book, there will probably be trouble there. But I think it's, like Anne Labastille said, part of the wonder of the Adirondacks is the idea that they're both beautiful and perilous, and that it is easy to get lost in the woods, metaphorically and physically. And I think that sense of danger really underscores the beauty of it. I feel really lucky to have spent the amount of time that I've spent there. And I know my kids now do too. And hopefully they'll pass that tradition on to their kids if they have any.
You still wish the book were called Self-Reliance?
No, I think The God of the Woods is a better title, after all. I concede.
It is funny. At one point, there are a couple of characters who kind of throw shade at Thoreau.
Yeah. I have to admit that I have mixed emotions about Thoreau, and some of the words coming out of the character's mouth are thoughts that I too have had.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. I'll let readers read to find the quote and to decide whether they agree or disagree. But I have mixed thoughts on Thoreau.
It's a weird way to end an interview, but
mixed thoughts on Thoreau.
Well, listen, Liz Moore, it's an amazing book. It was difficult to put down. So congratulations on really a terrific achievement.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Writer Liz Moore speaking to us from her home in Philadelphia. Her latest novel is called The God of the Woods, and it is set in and around the southern Adirondacks. You'll find a link to more about her and the book at ncpr.org/northwards. One last break, and then we'll meet a North Country woman whose post-retirement life is a work of art. This is Northwards from NCPR.
Northwards on NCPR is supported by Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Mountain Lake, hosting a variety of creative workshops, including glass etching and paddle making. Learn more at theadkx.org. And by The Book Nook, an independent bookstore located on Broadway in Saranac Lake, on Facebook at SL Book Nook.
More of Northwards now. I'm Mitch Tyke. A few months ago, we met Jim Bourrie on this show, a guy whose life had the odd trajectory of going from selling plumbing supplies to becoming the self-proclaimed poet laureate of Dickinson Center in retirement. Our guest today tells another story of reinvention. Donna Stoner spends summers in the Adirondacks and winters in the retirement hotspot of Syracuse. And one of the things, probably the key thing in her post-retirement life, is art. Both her own and the work of other artists. She is a watercolorist, a member of a painting group, and coordinates an annual plein-air painting event at View Arts in Old Forge, which wrapped up last weekend. So listen, and you might learn something about art or about life. Donna Stoner, it is a delight to talk with you.
Oh, thank you, Mitch. I really appreciate the time you're taking with me.
Before we get to the plein air event that's bringing us together for this conversation, I want to hear about your own journey to art and watercolor in particular. There is a point on your timeline where you were the volunteer coordinator at a hospital in Syracuse, and then a point where you became an artist. How did you get from there to here?
Well, I was actually a volunteer director at two of the big hospitals in Syracuse. And the big part of my job was interviewing people, which I love doing. And I spent a lot of time talking to people because I figured the more you know about what somebody's interests and motives are, the more likely I am to make a good volunteer match, which means they're more likely to stay. And without quite realizing it, all those years I was kind of taking notes because many of the people that I interviewed were either about to retire or were retired. And I could tell the difference between people who were really happy being retired and satisfied with their choices and all versus people that just really didn't know what to do with themselves. So when I left Upstate Medical University at the end of 2009, I had a short list with me. And one of the items on the short list was that since I had kind of discarded all the arts kinds of things that I had done over the years, just because life got complicated, that I wanted to reconnect. And I wasn't sure how, but I planned to do that. At the time, my now husband and I were coming up to the Adirondacks, and I remember going to the National Watercolor exhibition, which is currently on at View, and people should come up to see it. We went, and I remember a couple of paintings where I thought, oh my gosh, to be able to express myself like that would be just unbelievable. I tucked that aside. I wasn't quite retired yet. And then when I did retire, I started painting children's furniture because that seemed practical. But the first thing I did was to contact View, the art center here in Old Forge, and say, whatever you're teaching next Monday, sign me up. And by the way, what is it? What do I need? Because I thought, how lucky can you get? I can pay $40 or something like that and spend a day doing something. Somebody's going to teach me. Maybe I'll love it. Maybe I won't. It doesn't matter. It's just so beautiful that I can do that. So then I realized what I really wanted to do was watercolor, and I knew I was going to be in over my head. So I came back to View again and said, I want to learn how to watercolor. What can I do? Where do I start?
And I don't remember much about high school art class, but I do remember that watercolors were not easy.
Oh, watercolors. So after I started, a few people said, good God, why did you pick watercolor? It's the hardest. And I said, and why didn't you tell me that? So I decided.
Why did you pick watercolor?
You know, I was just walking into the View building half an hour ago, and I met a couple from Cooperstown. They were coming out of View. They had just seen the National Watercolor Exhibition. We got to talking. They were just overjoyed. But the thing we had in common was that this fella's father used to make the frames for a W.B. Romling, who was I think, just a rock star watercolorist. He's no longer with us. Anyhow, this fella made the frames for these paintings, and I said, oh, what a coincidence. My parents had two Romling paintings in their house, and every time I would visit, always looking over their shoulders where we happened to be sitting, were the two Romlings. I now own them and have for years, and I think that's in large part, I just have always been drawn to the look of watercolor. And I learned, it took me a while, but I've learned watercolor is a lot more forgiving than people let on. I think they were trying to scare me.
How do you describe what it is like to do that to friends or someone who doesn't paint?
What I would say is, whatever you ask other people about how to do it, don't particularly listen because you got to find your own way. Don't buy a lot of materials, just start. And just some wise friend of mine, when I started, said, carry a little sketchbook in your pocket of your purse, whatever you've got, and just 10 minutes a day, it's at work, we're waiting for the dentist, whatever, just start sketching, because what you're doing is you're training your eye to see. And no matter what you do, the better you see, the better you'll be able to interpret what you see into whatever form of art you choose. So yeah, my advice would be just start. don't fuss about what you don't know. Of course you don't know. You're not born a brain surgeon either. You gotta just do it, do it, do it, do it. But give yourself permission to enjoy just the process of learning.
Was it hard to do that as as a grown up? You know, I have a son in high school and a daughter in college, and they're you know, they're both sort of far along, but they're still young people. And I
Sure.
think of myself as, you know, as a kid and doing creative things for the sake of being creative. And then I think about being an adult and always wanting to get it right, and that sort of self censorship that we take on as adults.
Yep. Yeah, we're hard on ourselves.
Yeah.
We really are. Maybe that's why I love my Mountain Air Painter group so much, because there's every kind of person there from all over the central Adirondack area. And we're all very much adults. And so we give each other a hard time. We joke around a lot. We encourage each other. We goof off, it's just a really wonderful, nurturing kind of group. But yeah, I think, sure, we're hard on ourselves. But by the same token, don't you think most of us, as we retire and are aging, are being more selective about how we spend our time, and also enjoying not having to worry about time so much? So if I go in my shedio, which is my painting studio in a shed up here at camp, if I go in there, it's the most delicious feeling, Mitch, that I don't care what time it is. If somebody needs me, they know where to find me, but hours and hours will go by and I don't have to account for my time, and it's just paper and paint, and I just go for it.
Can I retire tomorrow? That sounds amazing.
It's wonderful. Yes, I'm lucky.
I mean, you were talking about that point at which you were about to retire and realizing that there were all these pieces of art from your life
Oh, yeah.
that you had cast off over the course of your adulthood. I mean, a few months ago, I had a conversation with a poet, a pretty accomplished poet, but he came to it in retirement. But even while he was working those several careers over his life, he had always at least written for himself. Were there artistic things that you pursued even as you were a volunteer director and had these other parts of your career?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. There's lots of different ways to define art, too. A lot of people say, ridiculous things like, I don't have any talent. I can't do anything. I just love to photograph, or I love to, knit. And I think that's an art form. That's a creative expression art form. I did practical things early in my life when my kids were young and I was new at housekeeping and all. I sewed a lot, because that made sense. At one point, I actually took an oil painting class at the YMCA in Syracuse, and I still don't remember why I did that, but I'm glad I did. And I painted in oils just for the duration of that class, and then I never picked it up again. Oil is complicated, I think, just because of the chemicals and stuff, and my children were young, so I just never did anything with that.
You mentioned the group of artists that you're a part of, the Mountain Air Painters,
Mhm.
and I gather you the group of you. Do you do a lot of plein air painting?
Every Thursday. um really year round now, but from May through October we meet every Thursday someplace different. We're fortunate, we've gotten enough of a reputation now. We're getting invited to some wonderful places that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see or have access to. But we also paint downtown, the train station, just a whole different bunch of places. So we do that every Thursday. And then in the late fall, a lot of us travel, like I go south to Syracuse, but a small group, and some of us come up from time to time. We meet here at View on Fridays. And then we switch from being the Mountain Air Painters to the Polar Bear Painters.
Well, and this is of course a great segue to plein air painting itself, and the plein air paint out coming up, the plein air paint out coming up.
Mhm.
Before we get to the event itself, for people who might not be familiar with the term, I think a lot of us know it, but what is the significance of plein air painting and a group of you that like the idea that this is a pastime that is not a solo endeavor?
Right, because most people think when you paint, you need to be quiet and be in solitude. And, studio painting, yeah, or studio painting, yes, of course.
Yeah, we
You're
think of the
usually by
tortured
yourself.
artist,
Yes, right.
throwing paint at the
Yeah.
canvas.
But then think about, oh my gosh, the Hudson River School of Painters and many others in our history where people would, cart all these supplies because many of them were painting in oil, literally miles through the wilderness to capture and comment on, whatever they're seeing or feeling. And it's also like this year we've added 3 new members. One of them is brand new to painting, and the other 2 are at various stages, but just kind of jumping back in. And the camaraderie is terrific. I remember how I felt. I still do. Um, these are my friends, and they'll give me feedback and, ideas and suggestions and mock me sometimes. And actually, right now at the Old Forge Library, there's a show of the Mountaineer painters called Moose River Rocks, because we all paint together at this one particular spot along the Moose, and we love it there. So the library invited us to have an exhibit where it's it's all of our interpretations of the view from this one particular spot along the river.
I was just about to bring that up because when we first chatted about chatting, the thing that seemed most delicious to me about the experience is that you can have a group of people and they're all painting, the same subject matter, but they all
Yep.
come to it with their own interpretation.
Absolutely. Yep. Different medium, just different everything. Yep. Yep.
Well, so let me bring things sort of full circle. When you are in your shedio or you're out someplace in the fresh air and you're working with your watercolors and your brushes and your canvas, what are you feeling?
Well, first of all, just being out in the fresh air, not with my friends on Thursday, but just me. Just being out in the fresh air for the express purpose of standing still and observing and feeling and hearing everything going on around me, and then taking the time, which takes a lot of time for me, to figure out what I want to paint and why do I want to paint it? What is it about that particular scene that I think I should comment about in my painting? So that just feels, I mean, it's frustrating to try and figure out what I'm going to paint. Some, but mostly it just feels so wonderful to be able to do that. Yeah, that's how I feel. Then I start painting and I get completely carried away. I do a sketch. I might do a color study like you're supposed to, but I very often jump ahead just because I just get so excited when that paint hits the water and does its magic. And I often don't have any clue what it's going to do. And sometimes it's not so great, but more often than not, it's just a delightful surprise. And I think, well, that sap green, that just kind of bled all over the place. But look at all the beautiful stuff it did with these other adjacent colors. So I am always just happy to be painting.
Donna Stoner, it has been really a delight to get to know you.
Thank you, Mitch.
Donna Stoner is a watercolor artist and coordinates the annual plein air paint out and auction for View Arts Center in Old Forge, which took place last week. Stop by ncpr.org/northwards and you can see some of Donna Stoner's artwork and also find out how you can subscribe to the Northwards podcast and get new interviews every week. That's all for the August edition of Northwards. Digital oversight of the show comes from Ethan Shanty and Bill Hanel. Caitlin Kelly does our social media. Doyle Dean shoots video. Our theme music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. And I am Mitch Tyke, your humble host and producer. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great weekend.